Vanessa, the Crafty Gemini, and in this sewing tutorial, I'm going to teach you how to make the cutest little rounded drawstring pouch. Supplies. You're going to need some fabric, and you'll need two, one for the exterior and one for the lining. I'm using 100% cotton fabric here. Then I'll also be using some cotton woven fusible interfacing, and I'll link to you where you can find that in our online shop. You'll obviously need something to cut your fabric with, your clips, basic sewing supplies, a sewing machine. And then for the template, I'm going to show you how to make it. So we'll get one 8.5 inch by 11 sheet of paper with a compass. If you don't have a compass, you can also use a plate, all right? And then for the drawstring portion of it, I have used this spaghetti. It's a t-shirt yarn that you can use, which I love for doing things like this. It doesn't unravel, doesn't take any time at all. We just cut it to length and it works perfectly for this type of project. And then you'll also need one large safety pin. All right, so let's get all of this stuff out of the way and make our template. Now the base of our template begins with one 8-inch diameter circle. So if you have a saucer or a plate that measures 8 inches across, you can just flip it on here and trace it around, and then we'll move on to the next step. I'm going to use a compass, so I'm going to set the radius to 4 inches, and that's half of 8 for the diameter that I need, and I'm just going to draw myself out a circle on this sheet of paper. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and trace on or cut out on the line so I can start with that 8-inch circle. Now I'm going to grab a ruler and my rotary cutter, and off of any side you want to take off 1.5 inches because we need to have a straight side going somewhere. So I'm just going to place my ruler here and look for the 1.5 inch line on my ruler, which is going to be this dashed line here, and I'm going to place that dashed line right on the edge, the outer edge of the circle. You see where that is? So from here to here is 1 inch to the solid line, and I can see that the edge of my circle is right there at 1.5 inch. So I'm basically taking off 1.5 inch off of one of the rounded sides or edges here. All right, and now your template is complete. And you can see how that is going to help us cut out our fabric and interfacing to end up with the little pouch. All right, so let's go ahead and starch and press our fabrics to begin with. And because I have kind of a directional print here, I'm going to just cut it out one layer at a time. So the way that these flowers read, this is the top. So whatever the top is of your directional print, you want it to be along the straight edge here, because obviously that straight edge is going to be the top. So you want your design to read top down. And then for cutting around curves, I always recommend a smaller rotary cutter blade. You can still cut it with this because it's not that tight of a curve, but I do find that the smaller rotary cutter blade allows me to cut through smoother. On something that's not necessarily directional, or that I don't care if the direction is offset, I'm just going to fold it so that I can cut through both layers at once. And then for cutting the interfacing, you can either cut 2 pieces out using the template, or I oftentimes like to take the actual piece that it's going to get fused to, and I place it wrong sides touching the same way that it's going to be fused. This is a scratchier of the 2 sides because there's tiny dots of adhesive here, so I will place it right there. And that way when I cut around it and use my fabric as a template, I know it's going to be the exact size. You can also fold the interfacing in half and cut 2 layers at once like we just did with the lining fabric. All that stuff is personal preference. Now let's take the exterior fabric with the matching interfacing piece over to the ironing board so we can fuse them together. So far we have the 2 interfaced exterior pieces, 2 lining pieces, and then we still need to cut out 2 rectangular strips that are going to turn into the casing that we have up top. This is great to add an additional pop of color. You can use any scraps you have. I'm going to just go ahead and use the same lining fabric, and these 2 strips should be cut to 2 inches by 6 inches long. All right, so we have all the fabric pieces that we need to get started. Now let's prep these casing strips so we can add them to the exterior pieces. To prep these, we're just going to flip the strip pretty side face down, and on the short ends here, I'm just going to turn it towards the wrong side of the fabric by 1/4 of an inch and press that into place. I'll do it to both short ends of both strips. Now we'll head to the sewing machine, and from the pretty side of the strip, we're going to stitch just shy of 1/4 inch straight down this way and repeat to all the sides that we turned under to secure those raw edges in place. All right, so I have a straight stitch on my machine set to 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and the stitch length is about a 2.4. You don't have to back stitch at the beginning or at the end here. The raw edges are going to get concealed anyways. Trim your threads, and then let's head back to the ironing board. All right, a quick press to set those stitches, then let's flip it pretty side face down, and we're going to fold it in half lengthwise, matching up the raw edges up top. Then press that into place. All right, now let's take the exterior pieces. We're going to fold them in half along the top edge, like that, and then crease it just right there to locate the center along this top edge. You'll do the same thing to the little casing strips. And we're going to match them up one on top of the other here, casing strip on top of exterior, with the little halfway marks that we just created, one on top of the other. And that's going to ensure that this is centered along this top edge, so you have the same distance here and here. Then grab your clips or pins and secure that along the top edge, making sure that the raw edges are matching. And then we'll do that to the other one also. Now let's head over to the sewing machine, and using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, we're going to stitch across the top here, back stitching at the beginning and ends of both of these. This is just going to basically be basting the casing into place, so we want to go with a narrow seam allowance just to tack the two pieces together. And I said 1/8 of an inch because that's really narrow, but it can also be 1/4 of an inch. Just go narrow, because the final seam that's going to be in this area is going to be 3/8 of an inch. So whatever you stitch here needs to be smaller than that amount. Next up, let's place our lining pieces one on top of each of these, with the pretty side of the lining fabric facing down on top of the exterior. Place some clips only along the top edge again. And we're going to use a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to stitch all the way across this time, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and at the end. So again, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance this time, backstitch. All right, so now you could go ahead and give this a press. I'm just going to move on to the next step so I can show you what to do. You're going to take one of these, open them up, do the same thing with the other, and you're going to place one on top of the other with pretty sides touching so that the exterior fabrics are facing each other and the lining fabrics are facing each other, so everything matches like that. Then I like to go over to the side here and make sure that these intersections are matching up perfectly, and I'll put a clip right there. Same thing on the other side. All right, so then you can go ahead and grab clips, and you can clip all the way around the rounded portions of both sides if you feel like it. I'm going to skip that step because I can manipulate and hold this pretty easily. It's not that big of a project. Now we do need to leave an opening in the lining portion. I usually like to leave an opening in a straight area so that I get a cleaner finish in the end, but because this entire section of the lining is round, you have no other choice really. So just leave yourself about 2 to 3 inches somewhere along the side of the lining. That way it's a little bit more hidden, nobody's going to see it. Now I'm going to share with you another tip. In the lining section, we're going to use a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then when we're sewing around the curves of the exterior part, we're just going to use a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And by using a larger seam allowance on the lining portion, it's going to allow the lining to sit a little bit neater inside of the bag because the bag part itself will be smaller, all right? And this is a tip that I often share and works really, really well when we're making handbag linings. So I'm going to start somewhere close to the top here. Remember, we're on the lining, so let me set my machine up to 3/8 of an inch. the bigger seam allowance of the two. Make sure to take a couple back stitches. And then I'm going to keep that seam allowance until I hit this seam here. And I'm going to stop with the needle down to pivot. Boom. I'm going to pivot there because now I need to come around this section, but now we're on the exterior side of the bag. So I know that I need to decrease the seam allowance. Instead of 3/8 that we just did, I need to bump it down to 1/4 of an inch. So this is how I like to do it. I'm going to hold it steady so the fabric doesn't move. I'm going to take the needle out of the fabric so the needle's up. Now I'm going to select on my machine 1/4 of an inch, which on this machine it bumps the needle over. That's why I take it out of the fabric, okay? Now I'm going to put the needle back down. Just tap it once. I held it down too long, that's why it took a full stitch. But then just tap it once to bring the needle into the project. And now that it's holding my position again, I can lift the presser foot and properly pivot to then come around with this new seam allowance, okay? So I'm just gonna come down this way and work my way around the curve with the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, making sure that my raw edges, everything matches. And notice how I'm using my hand to hold everything in place. And it's just like this rotating motion of my hand. So I do maybe 2 inches or so and then stop, reposition my hand and continue. And that's really a helpful tip when you're sewing around curves. I find that you get a smoother seam if you go just nice and easy. If you go super duper slow and you're kind of stopping and pivoting every couple stitches, you're going to get a really choppy and jagged stitch line there. All right, so we're still with the 1/4 of an inch seam. I'm going to continue it until, again, I hit this stitch line here. I'm going to take the needle out of the project, bump back to my 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, bring the needle back into the project, presser foot up and pivot, and now we're going into the lining portion again with the larger seam allowance. And as you work your way around, remember to stop a couple of inches shy of your first initial stitches because you got to leave that opening. All right, I'm going to stop there, back stitch to secure the other end of that opening. All right, so now we need to trim around these edges to grate it or clip it or whatever you want to call it. A few different ways that you can do it. You can shave a little off with some pinking shears, and that's going to allow the curve to finish nicely once we flip the whole thing out. So you can just go to the pivot corner and then pick up again on the lining portion. You don't really want to be shaving off the seam allowance area where the opening is. So I would skip this area and then do the same thing with your pinking shears to the opposite side. There are also pinking shear edge or pinked edge rotary cutters that you can use. And this is a slight pinking blade that I have on this rotary cutter, and I'll show you on the lining portion what this does. And I just get it kind of close to that seam line just to trim away most of that seam allowance, especially on the lining side since we went with a bigger seam allowance. You can take most of it off and just get close. That's going to allow the fabric to be pushed out nicely in the end, okay? So you can do that also. If you don't have either of these tools, you can also just cut some clips into the curve, which is basically the entire pouch, by cutting in a little triangle, one at a time like this, so that it looks basically like little teeth marks have gone into your seam allowance. All right, so those are all your different options. I'm going to finish off here with these pinking shears real quick. All right, now let's reach in the opening and carefully flip the whole thing right side out. All right, so give it a little press, and then in the area where the opening is, we're just going to turn in the seam allowance. And it's not going to be perfect because, again, it's on a curve and it's a bigger seam allowance, so you can see that it ends up being just a little bit straight, which is not a big deal. So I'm just going to press that shut there. And we're going to head over to the sewing machine and stitch super close to the outer edge, a back stitching at the beginning and at the end to secure the opening shut. And you can always stitch this shut by hand, but you probably know me by now, and I never do that for these little quickie projects. Push the lining into the pouch. and I'm going to give it another press to help everything sit nicely in place. And because of the larger seam allowance that we use, you can see how nicely the lining lies right inside of the exterior pieces of the pouch. All right, now let's grab our cord, our safety pin, and make the drawstring. Now for the drawstring, you'll need 2 pieces of whatever you're going to use for the drawstring pulls that measure 20 inches in length. And that's the size that I found I like and works well for this project, or for this size project, I should say. There's one 20-inch. And remember, I'll include a link on where you can find this spaghetti yarn. If you can't find this t-shirt yarn or you don't have it, there are a ton of other things you can use. You can use drawstring cording, like they sell it by the yard at a craft shop. You can use paracord, ribbon, a strip of fabric that you make yourself, t-shirt strips. If you just cut them and tug on them, they'll roll on themselves like that if it's a cotton jersey fabric. So anything you want to pull through here. I'm going to feed my safety pin through one end of one strip. Close the safety pin. And I'm going to feed it starting on this side. I'm going to come through here, through to the back, and come out here. So both cut ends should be coming out on one side. I'm just pushing that safety pin through, and it's bringing the strip of spaghetti yarn with it. And notice I've come out here, I'm coming into the next one. All right, now I can remove my safety pin, and before I do anything with the other one, I'm gonna pull these so it's nice and flat, match up these 2 short ends, and right there tie a knot, including both of them. Like grab both ends and tie yourself a knot so they don't go anywhere. Okay, that's the first one. The second one, we're going to do the same thing, but you see how these 2 come out on this side? This one needs to have the knot coming out on this side. So we'll feed safety pin again through here. And this time, start on the side that doesn't have the knot. So this knot is here. I'm going to start on this side. And you're going to go right in through where the first strip is going through. No worries. They need to overlap. And by now, you'll notice that it's getting a little tight in the casing. You can still continue to push it through. No worries. Just don't pull it all the way through the casing. Make sure you have something hanging out here. And then I'm going to go from here into the next one. All right, and now my 2 short ends are on this side. You're done with the safety pin. Again, stretch that out so it lies flat. Then grab your 2 short ends, make them even, and tie yourself a knot. Okay, and there you have it. Now you have a working drawstring for your little round pouch. Isn't that super cute? I think it is just adorable. All right, so give it a final press, and then you're good to go.
All right, so there you have it. That's all it takes to make these mini rounded drawstring pouches. Remember, if you're looking for any of the supplies or materials I used to create the project, I include links for you in the description box below. If you enjoyed the video, please feel free to give it a thumbs up. If you have questions for me, just leave them in the comments section below. And don't forget to click the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of my future videos. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye. Any of my future videos. Thanks again for watching, and remember, I always include links. I forgot to say that early on. Get your hands on the interfacing. We sell it in our online shop. Oop, I hit my mic. Sorry. Little thread snips, also my stitch markers, maybe the pattern to a pattern. The pattern to a pattern, really?